Okay, welcome to another episode of Master of the Skies, the weather briefing show. I'm Lionel Perro, a professional weather forecaster, and in this episode, we'll be talking about the weather conditions that have led to the horrific Los Angeles wildfires that have really done horrendous damage. And unfortunately, several lives that have been lost. And I just wanted to describe to you a little bit what the weather conditions are and still ongoing that are actually still favoring these fires. You might have heard in the media, they talk a lot about the Santa Ana winds. And so we'll be taking a look now at some of the conditions that lead to these Santa Ana wind conditions. But maybe to start off with, let me just show you what actually some of these fires have been looking like from the shore of Southern California. As you take a look over the mountainous regions, you can just see these horrific flames linked to these fires. And I'm not really going to show you any more pictures of the damages because that's not the goal of this episode. I'm really here to show you a little bit how these conditions come about in terms of the meteorology. So typically with the Santa Ana winds, what you need is a center of high pressure, usually over the Great Basin area. And then on what typically happens is you also have sort of a low pressure system, either offshore of the Pacific or sometimes over Baja California. And between the two, you have sort of a pressure gradient. And usually the stronger the pressure gradient, the stronger the winds. And as winds flow in a clockwise manner around high pressure in the northern hemisphere, you'll basically have a southerly flow on the eastern side of the high that basically slopes down from the Great Basin area into sort of the Mojave Desert area, and then will be forced over the transverse ranges before subsiding over the Los Angeles area and then blowing offshore. So those are typically the sort of surface meteorological conditions that you need. And if we zoom in a little bit more closely here, you have the Mojave Desert here to the right, the transverse mountain ranges here that the airflow has to go over. Since this air is really, really dry, even with lift and cooling, it usually doesn't saturate much along the transverse mountain peaks. And so as the air slopes downward, it compresses, it heats adiabatically. And so you're basically going to end up with warm and very, very dry air on the leeward side of this chain. And usually when you have hot, dry conditions plus winds, usually that's an unfortunate recipe for wildfires. And that's what's typically so some of the conditions that you'll see during Santa Ana wind conditions. So with that being said, also maybe to just extrapolate on that, typically, as I mentioned, the stronger the pressure gradient between the high over the Great Basin and the low over the Baja California, usually the stronger the winds will be. And so there's sort of a rule of thumb that says, depending on your pressure gradient between Las Vegas and Los Angeles, about 9 millibars or 9 hectopascals that usually favor Santa Ana wind that tends to be stronger and stronger. Okay, so now let's take a look a little bit about what's going on here with the current conditions. So if we take a look here on windy.com, we could take a look at the 500 millibar level or 500 hectopascal level. You can see that we have a ridge of high pressure that's sort of really is holding in here over the western coast of the U.S. As you know, if you followed my weather forecasting training course, ridges aloft are usually associated with high pressure regions at the surface. And so usually the surface high is usually typically located about midway between the ridge axis and the trough axis, and that would put a high pressure at the surface, probably somewhere around the Great Basin area. And if we slope down and see what's going on at the surface, and we go on and take a look at the pressure, you can indeed see that we have high pressure here in that region with a tight pressure gradient between this high over the Great Basin area and this low over northern Mexico, Baja California. And so you have a strong pressure gradient, and that really favors offshore winds in the Los Angeles area that you can see here active still, and that's never good news in terms of trying to extinguish these fires. Now, granted, the winds right now aren't all that very strong. You have about 3 to 4 knots. That's not very strong, but nevertheless, it's still a dry wind coming down, and so that's not very good. If you take a look at the temperatures, you could see that the temperatures on the lee side of the transverse ranges with the adiabatic compression and the downsloping winds, you get rather warm temperatures with respect to the neighboring areas that are much cooler. And so these temperatures are in degrees Celsius, but you could see that in the Los Angeles area with these Santa Ana winds, you typically get rather warm weather for the season and very, very dry air. Okay, if I zoom out a little bit again, and so let me take those temperatures off, you could see that this high pressure of 1049 millibars, that's extremely high. And as it turns out, that's also being responsible for ushering in basically a cold air Arctic outbreak over the central and eastern part of the U.S. If I go on to the temperatures, you can see this Arctic air over much of Canada that with time as we go on, you can see that this air is really over the next couple of days going to be falling into the eastern half of the nation and causing some brutally cold temperatures in that area. But you could see that the high pressure area over the western coast, unfortunately, is going to be still with us for at least a couple more or 3 or 4 days, which will unfortunately still favor some of these offshore conditions. So we'll get back to the forecast coming up a little bit later for the region. But if we take a look at what's going on with the fires, you could see that with respect to the Eaton fire, it's about 87% contained. And the Palisades fire about 59% contained. If we take a look at the individual regions, you could still see some of the regions that are under evacuation order, whether it be for the Palisades fire or the Eaton fire. So these are still really pretty critical conditions. Something that needs to be said is that we are in a long-term severe drought in the area, and so that certainly doesn't help when you have a lot of vegetation that's extremely dry, and then you put on top of that these atmospheric conditions with the very dry, warm air coupled with these Santa Ana winds. That really favors the ignition of some of these fires, and then it becomes really, really hard to extinguish them. Something to be said too, a lot of the vegetation in the area is made up of chaparral, and that tends to really catch on fire pretty quickly, unfortunately, and that's probably also sort of an aggravating factor. Now, for those of you who are not too familiar with the Santa Ana winds or are from other regions of the world, you might have heard of the foehn winds. There are also sort of downsloping winds, but Santa Anas are not really comparable to the foehn winds, since with the foehn winds on the windward side, you typically get clouds and precipitation, and then through latent heat release, and then with the downsloping wind on the leeward side, you will tend to get very warm conditions. And so with the Santa Ana, since the air over the Mojave Desert is extremely dry, you typically don't get much clouds and or any precipitation. And so while it's a katabatic wind on the leeward side, the Santa Ana doesn't really extract any latent heat from the air mass. And so in that respect, it's not really sort of a foehn wind. It's more like, for those of you in Europe know the Boer wind, where you have sort of a dry, usually continental polar air mass that comes sliding down from the Eurasian continent against the mountain slopes along the Adriatic, and then on the leeward side of these mountain chains over the Balkans, then the air will compress and heat but since the air is extremely cold, this air will remain cold, just not as cold as the other side. But there's no really late heat extraction, and usually this process resembles more of what happens with the Santa Ana winds, even though the Santa Ana winds are usually much warmer. Even though there is a version of the Santa Ana that's actually pretty cold and actually also produces extremely strong wind gusts. So that's that for that. And also something to take into account also is the fact that regarding El Nino, La Nina, typically right now we're in the La Nina conditions, which tends to favor more cool ocean waters over the equatorial Pacific and over the western coast of northern South America and Mexico. And so in these conditions, we tend to favor more drier conditions over the Southern California region, which usually is more favorable, unfortunately, for the sustainment of some of these Santa Ana winds. Now, you can see that through the Southern Oscillation Index that we're in a weak sort of La Nina. If for those of you who don't remember what El Nino or La Nina is, typically in El Nino years, you tend to have weakened easterly trade winds, which favor the flow of warm water towards the western coast of South America. During normal conditions, the easterly trade winds really blow much stronger and typically just keep this warm water over sort of Australia region and over the western Pacific. And so we're more in this normal year sort of going into La Nina. And so with that sort of conceptual model and version of what's going on now, you will tend to get these sort of conditions with regards to the ocean waters and these kind of weather conditions linked to the wintertime patterns associated with these two differing patterns. So during El Nino patterns, you tend to have sort of a wetter weather pattern over the southwestern U.S. And during winter La Nina patterns, you tend to have a drier sort of weather conditions due to a persistent upper level ridge that tends to stagnate over the western coast of the U.S., as we've just seen with the conditions that we saw with that big ridge over the western part of the U.S. So with that being said, we can go back and sort of take a look at what we might expect over the next few days in terms of the persistence or not of the Santa Ana wind. And so if we take a look at the surface conditions, and I'll put the winds back on here, you could see that unfortunately, at least through Wednesday, we still do have, for the majority, sort of a offshore flow with a weak Santa Ana that still is active. But as we will get closer to the end of the week, it looks like we're going to have a deepening trough aloft along the western coast of the U.S. That's going to help drive a surface low pressure system over Southern California with finally sort of an onshore flow of wind, which should help sort of inject some moisture into that area and help in producing some much needed rain, albeit maybe not necessarily very heavy, but at least it should allow for a humidification of the air mass and help at least battle the remaining wildfires more efficiently. We can see that also if I go through and click on some of the rain forecasts from the European model. As we go into Thursday and Friday, we still have the Santa Anas, and then starting on Saturday, we start to get more of a onshore flow with that low pressure system, and you could see that some much needed rain is being forecast in that area, which should help alleviate these fire conditions and help extinguish, or at least partially extinguish, the remaining fires that are burning in that area. So there you go. For a longer forecast, it's hard to say. It looks like by Monday or Tuesday of next week, some of that precipitation will probably advect out over towards the east, but at least over the next weekend during the January 25th to Sunday 26th time frame, that area should get some much needed rain. So there you go. That's it for this Santa Ana meteorological explanation with regards to these horrific Los Angeles fires. And I wish you some nice week, and I will catch you on the next episode. Take care.